Stay right there. What are you waiting for? Kill them! Kill them both! No, wait a minute. Is it money you're after? I'll give you as much as you want.
May the saints forgive you, because I won't.
If you want to check out any of my links, you can go to Linktree and just Linktree RMARX, and that'll pull up all my miscellaneous social media pages, my website, my Patreon, my YouTube, everything. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Robby. And it has been, although in fairness, I have actually worked with you several times since you last on this show, but it has been a while since you've had your, when I first started really the show, you were really one of my first I chose people that I thought would give a good foundation for what could come later, even though I didn't fully understand what that would be. But, it has developed into something more than I thought it was. So I think to have you come back, it's like the right time. We can sort of do I think I mean, I hope you still want to do a series, and so when you came to me to do this idea, I was like, this is exactly the kind of podcasting work I want to be doing. This is like with people like you, who has been someone that I've thought was awesome and just a great researcher for so long. So to do this, I think is really cool. So why don't you introduce, I guess, everyone else to the topics?
Yeah, so when we look at the expansive movement of Eastern and Western theology, one of the foundational books within the whole idea of the biblical canon is the Book of Enoch, and it's a very intriguing and interesting book. If you want to, I would encourage everyone out there to go pick up the books of Enoch. The first book of Enoch is the Ethiopic, or from Ethiopia, and it dates to the 2nd century BC, and it comes from possibly an earlier oral tradition. And then there's the second book of Enoch, which is the Slavonic secrets of Enoch. And then there's the third book of Enoch, which is the Judaic book of Enoch. Now, the book we're going to specifically be talking about here, the first book of Enoch, we're going to do a show on each book of Enoch, 1, 2, and 3. And the first book of Enoch was considered to be an authentic Jewish text that remained popular in its time for at least some 500 years. So it's considered to be one of the earliest Ethiopian texts. It's thought that it was derived from a Greek text, interestingly, because you have that interplay between Greece and Egypt, and going back and forth of all these philosophers to basically go and instill themselves and learn the mysteries that are coming out of, you have the mysteries of Egypt, you have the mysteries of Phrygia, which Phrygia interacted greatly with Greece, and then you have the mysteries of Syria. And there's other mysteries, but these are some of the more substantial ones that we can kind of trace down through the ages. And that Greek text that it was translated from is believed to be copied from an earlier Aramaic text. So it's got quite the history,
What I find really interesting about Enoch is that it has these layers of, you could say, as you know, I'm a Central Asianist in my sort of worldview, how I think of the mystery schools or the esoteric traditions. I think it comes from a place probably under some kind of Persian or proto-Persian influence in Central Asia.
Right.
I don't necessarily posit I have to be careful how I say this, Robby. I don't posit necessarily a racial component to it, simply because you can recognize that there are bloodlines that went off and then became completely other things. So I don't necessarily racialize it, because even the Tibetans might consider certain families in Tibet that might consider themselves like descendants of some of these Persian, sort of proto-Persian priests, or these Turkish priests, whatever. So that's why I don't, just because I look at it more in that Central Asian, it's like Hyperborea, everybody's kind of mixed race, and you can't there's not a clear delineation. So that's just how I look at it. But I think it's really interesting because the book actually shows these multiple layers of cultural influence, and you can see that it was used by multiple cultural groups.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is this was originally from the time of Ethiopia, in regard to the line of Menelik, the descendants of King Solomon, coming down with Queen of Sheba, when she was essentially, some say exiled, some say left, because of the turmoil and the trauma that was going on with all his miscellaneous wives and concubines. But she basically brought this book of Enoch with her into Ethiopia. And it was early on within Christianity, it was considered really as an inspired work. But then as time went on, you have King James, basically, when he reformulated the Bible and took it from 78, 72 books and reduced it down to 66 books, which is the current state of the King James Bible now, where they essentially said that the book of Enoch was apocryphal. And what's interesting is when you're going through the biblical canon, I believe Jesus mentions the book of Enoch. And there's, I think, 3 or 4 separate mentions of the book of Enoch within what is considered to be canonical. So in order to understand a lot of the Bible itself, and why the kind of story goes the way it goes, this background within Enoch kind of gives you the essential footing and understanding of the philosophical elements that built into and turned into modern day Judaism and Christianity, and even Islam.
Yeah, I think so. You touched on 3 really interesting components. This idea of the extra textual references in the Bible. I think that that's obvious, not just for the book of Enoch, but also for the book of Jubilees. We can see that a little bit in Genesis, right? There's clearly a difference between Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2. Oh, the King James. So I did want to touch on this. So in terms of practical magic, the King James is kind of the, I guess, we'll say the standard text for the medieval or Hermetic magician. And so my theory, or I guess my, not theory, it's a little more concretized than that, maybe even, but I think that there is some metaphysical component that is retained in the King James, however flawed the trimming, the haircut it received was. I think that there's still something in it that is useful, but like you say, I think this also serves like a metaphysical reason, like the numerology of reducing the book from to 66 And then originally 72, well, that's the reduction from the 9. So the 9 is a very important Hebrew Kabbalah number, but definitely the 12 is a much more important Christian Kabbalah number. So I think that that's why also you have like a little bit of discrepancy. You're sort of taking it from one mysticism into a related but different, also different sort of a mysticism.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that, definitely. And what's funny is with King James, when you look at him, the same time that they were reformulating the biblical canon, King James also released at the same time a book on demonology and how to find and basically control and slay demons. So King James, had as far as eschatological, he had a wide expand, and the fact that he's putting out a book on demonology, and when you trace back into the book of Enoch, it's the ideas that these fallen angelic forces, or these fallen energetic forces from higher realms that basically came into our realm and mated with the earth women, and that those offspring were the vessels from where the demons come from. For them to disclude and take that out of the Bible and to give no formal reference to that is an interesting overall prospect of all kinds of different possibilities.
Absolutely. And I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I know you will cover this, but I just want to say this because I think it responds really well to what you said, is the astronomical book of one Enoch, or the Book of Heavenly Luminaries. So I'm not that familiar with it. I've read it in preparation for us to do this conversation, but it's not like I didn't study it. Okay.
Right.
But for me, to remove the astrological and cosmological mapping, and because it gives such important numerology. I mean, the numerology is maybe the best contained in these astronomical and cosmological sort of mapping. So it can be, I think that it is very obfuscating. Like we spoke a little bit about this yesterday. Well, maybe not yesterday as when this episode comes out, but yesterday as in when we're date of record. So about the occulting of the astrological mysteries. You said this, and I thought it was super. I had honestly never thought of it quite like that. But there does seem to be at least even a tripartite understanding of astrology. Like, yes, okay, so for my example, we have Jyotish. So that's like the exterior astrology that everybody kind of knows and talks about on Twitter. But then we also have 2 more layers of Tantric astrology, which are very different, in fact, which have much more, I would say that the practices associated with them are much more theological, are much more ontological even. So they don't necessarily match up with this like popular idea of what astrology is. It's like something much deeper, and so the planets also take on a sort of different tone, like the different sort of nature. Like they're seen not as so archonic, and they're neither seen as so deified. It's neither, it's kind of neither nor. It's just like they are forces that can sometimes oppose us, and sometimes we can also utilize elements of what they embody to sort of climb the tree or move up the ladder, move across the floorboards or whatever.
Oh yeah. And so now I think one of the essential things to really kind of keep in mind when looking at the book of Enoch is that this is the evolving Zoroastrianism, or the Zoroastrianism, that is inflecting, coming into the Judaic, or the African, Egyptian thought, essentially. And when you go back to Zoroaster, he's the one that basically is behind the ideas of the angels, that each individual has a personal angel, that each city, town, the planet itself has its own angel, just as well as the sun and all the miscellaneous luminary bodies have that the stars are essentially angels themselves. So when you compare Zoroastrianism and how that's phase shifting into, as far as the book of Enoch being the early Judaic philosophy, we can kind of see the changes that are subtly happening as this culture is evolving and moving.
Okay, so you're totally speaking my language, Robby, because I think you also know this, is that I'm very interested in Zoroastrianism because I personally think that there is an incredible root, maybe the primary root even is found in it, or even in a proto Zoroastrianism, but definitely in the later Avestan, Bundasan, Gervanite, there's something that is contained in that it appears certainly in many magical or esoteric or mystery traditions, I think far ranging. So yeah, that is really, I thought it was really well said. And then I do want to ask your opinion on, because there's this idea, that a popular idea will say that Zoroaster rejected all the worship of all devas. But when I looked at some of the later writings, it wasn't quite clear to me if it was a rejection of all the devas, but there seemed to be these state prescribed lists of like devas that were still acceptable to perform certain, what we would call yajnik or like maybe Vedic style rites for, but most devas were excluded. But they had like a small, it was sort of like a quelling of the god list or god and demon list, so they could not necessarily control it in a centralized way, but they could have a central cult of their culture. And then also because how I understand it is that people were sort of wildly worshiping many things that appeared in the world. So like demons, yakshas, hosts. I know in Judaism, this was a big thing, was that people were worshiping what they called them the 7 traditional luminaries, but often it was really 9. And so they would have these sort of metallic statues of the angels, and they would worship those statues over God, over this idea of like more monistic or ephemeral God, which is really more what the deeper esoteric idea of God in the Old Testament is, even though he is often portrayed as the angry kind of storm god. Yes.
Oh yeah. Well, I think he was an evolving god form, but yeah, as far as that, in the biblical sense, they generally would call this the backsliders. As far as the practicing Jews that would fall away from supplicating, worshiping Inanna, Ishtar, essentially the queen of the heavens, which has to do with the idea of those luminary bodies interact and reflect upon the earth plane itself. Right. The other thing, when you really get into studying Enoch and the correspondences with Zoroaster, there's a huge body of work that believes that Enoch was Zoroaster and Zoroaster was Enoch. So that I find very interesting as well.
No, that's incredibly interesting. So I'll respond to both of those components and then I'll let you move on. Yeah. But I think, okay, so obviously I've told you this before, Tara, Ishtar. I feel like there's even like the etymological connection is undeniable. The meaning connection is undeniable. Even the association with the number 2, sort of like as the consort, but also as the queen. So she's kind of there, and then she's also kind of not there. She's both transcendent and eminent. But then we also know God is also there. But it's nebulous, and that's kind of what Tara Uma is also very much like in the Puranas. So I think that that's really interesting. And obviously the Tibetan mythos is that the star self-combusts. So when that happens, 51 pieces of you could say the meteorite or the star or the goddess herself all fell to earth. And then those became the Shakti Pitas, or the sort of places of the divine feminine force. Like each body part became like an object of worship. So I do think that this fits with the Ishtar myth and her sort of corpus being the kingdom, at least in Babylon, where they had the gate of Ishtar. So there's like an association where she is the actual walls, the fortress, the Netzach. She's kind of like she's the physical thing, and then she's also the corpus of ideas that sort of makes it a polity.
Right. Well, and when we get take us into what the book of Enoch is really all about, it's Enoch being the representative of humankind itself, right? Enoch was said to have lived 365 years, which is essentially the number of days in the year. So there's this correspondence there, between the earth itself and the man itself, right? But interestingly, Enoch details the fall of these Grigori, or these fallen angels that basically fell away in the heavens and came down to earth, and landed on Mount Hermon. And they basically, I've read some texts that they came to stop the involution of flesh, so that basically no more souls would fall into the gross manner of creation, being matter itself. But I've also read some other stories where essentially there's wars in the heaven and they turn against God and basically come here in the name of creating a kingdom for themselves. Because the idea is, and you get this in the Bhagavad Gita, you see this stories in several places where after humanity is created, they are essentially a higher form of entity within the universe over the angelic forces. So the newly created humans have this ability to transubstantiate, to basically move between all the realms of the mansions of the heavens. So it's the idea of transubstantiation, which the angels can't do. They're more hard found. They're more watching over things. And basically they were told to bow down to the humans. And, there's the whole story of Lucifer, and he's like, and even in the Bhagavad Gita, they're like, we have associated with humans long, we've been here before humans. We've associated with them since they got here, and basically they're the ones that should be bowing down to us. So there's this intrinsic counterplay between what forms are higher in the levels of creation, and these are embittered forces that basically came to earth and sought to corrupt humankind and what it was.
Okay, so I did recall what I wanted to say. So the thing about Enoch is it's interesting because you could say that, I know you know this, Robby, so I'm just saying this for the plebes out there. But Enoch can also be Adam Kadmon.
Oh yeah.
Enoch can also be Saint or I grew up Catholic, so Saint Elijah is how I would think of it, but it's Elijah the prophet. And then also Metatron can also be Enoch. So there's like a throughway well into the New Testament even.
Oh yeah.
And say John the Baptist, I've heard that before. I've heard Jesus is, the reincarnation of Enoch. I'm not saying it's liturgical or orthodox, but I think that there have been ideas percolating for a long time.
Right.
And then I also thought it was interesting you brought up the Bhagavad Gita, because this idea of Krishna consciousness has come up so often. I think in a parapolitical way, in a theosophical way, and then also, like, what does that mean? Because that does seem to be a rather potent, maybe governing, I'm going to call it a cult, but I'm not, it's non-pejorative.
It's right on the edge.
Right. It's like it's Krishna consciousness, but Krishna consciousness, interestingly, is also tied to the theosophical idea of Christ consciousness.
Correct.
And they have a deep relationship, and they're almost not distinct.
Right.
There might be differences, slight subtle differences in like the cosmology, but very, very closely related. So I think that there is this idea in Buddhism, definitely, that this is our world for sure. And that we are meant to forge ourselves. We are meant to follow a path. Now, I think that in terms of subjugation. I think this is really interesting because early Tantra, Buddhist Tantra really started out as a yaksha cult. So a cult, this is not everybody agrees with this, so let me just preface by saying that, but there are some French scholars who have been talking about this for quite a while, is that there's a lot of evidence that a lot of the Mahayana temples in India used to be almost completely Mahayana, with, interestingly enough, some Zoroastrian temples at the same period. So at this period, it was all mostly Buddhist, Mahayana, and so at these monasteries, they would practice Tantra at night. And so they would learn subjugation rituals to subjugate these kind of geniuses or angelic beings or even lower devas or demons or multiple things, and so to protect the monastery. So it started off as like a practical form of spirit magic, and then also became like apotheosized by saying, okay, we can take these ideas because the yaksha don't just exist in the lake, they don't just exist in the trees, they don't just exist in heaven, they also exist inside of you in portion.
Right.
And so, and interestingly, with the Bhagavad Gita, a tantric way to understand that is that Krishna is his own, he's sort of the vehicle that produces the asuras. So his own interaction with reality, his sin, his preconceptions, his own delusions, they all serve to create the asuras, who are really the gods, but just the shadow, sort of the shadow of them. I know I just upset a lot of Indians on Twitter. Okay. Let me just say that.
Well, and that's the whole thing, with all of this. It's I say it frequently. It's all very fractaline. It's all very dependent upon where these thought forms are picked up and the current understandings that reflect upon them. So it's I think that philosophy of eschatology is quite the fractal in regard to how it develops and moves and turns, and the different shifting opinions and views depending upon the background of who views the subject matter. It's much like history itself. But now these angels, in an attempt to corrupt humanity, on Mount Hermon, when they came down, there was 20 of them, and they were the leaders over the other minions. But these 20 base angels came down, and it was Shimyaza that basically was like, we need to go into the humanity and basically take wives of the men, basically take the women, the earth women, as wives for ourselves. And he's like, but I'm not sure that all of you are up to this, so maybe you don't want to participate. And they're like, oh no, we're all down to go and try to end humanity and corrupt it. And they took they cursed one another and took oaths and basically set about to corrupt the human element by going in and impregnating the earth women. It was said that they looked into the mysteries while they were in the heavens and basically taught them to humankind. It was said that they taught them root magic and how to use herbs and different roots. They taught them makeup, how to basically, doll yourself up for sexual means. One of them taught the swords of death, and how to slay infants in the womb. There's a whole variety of things that they come and teach humanity that basically help humanity to hurt itself.
This is very interesting because this is a very Buddhist idea as well, Robby, is that the idea that the Maras, these things, they exist in us, like these demons in the outside world that are teaching us bad things. That's also our own impulse to learn these things. It's not just right. It's not just that they are sure there's a supernatural layer, but then you can also think of it in this more maybe psychoanalytical, even though I don't like that phrase, but yeah, there's something like in you that is the impulsive it's just that draconic energy, that sort of impulse to do something that's not necessarily good or bad. It has no moral value. But yeah, I think that correlates very well to the Puranic understanding of like these asuras and sometimes the devas themselves, and oftentimes the devas, because oftentimes the asuras are given magical boons. Right, like a lot of the asuras in all the Puranas, they always have like some boon of immortality, boon of cannot be slayed by any god or any weapon or any this. So then it requires like an even more ferocious form. It requires even more energy, more sacrifice to destroy it. So yeah, it's very cyclical and very co-creative, I would say.
Yeah. Now with let's see, it said all corrupted. Yeah, all the people on the earth at the time were corrupted by the teachings of Azazel. And basically, this was the point at which God decided, and we get this with Jupiter talking about flooding the earth. We get this with the biblical text in regard to Noah and the deluge. But nonetheless, there's these multiple stories through different various community texts that basically talk about the people on the earth were becoming a problem. You get this in the Mayan text as well, and that basically they're going to flood the earth to wipe out all of the corruption, to basically cleanse the earth, and as a result, one of the angels comes down and takes Enoch on a night journey to basically warn him about the coming deluge because of the corruption on the face of the earth.
So this is actually something I wanted to touch on with you, is that so the fallen angels, so they are also known as the Bene Elohim. Is that correct, Robby? Okay, so the Elohim is one of the names of God that is at Chesed or Jupiter, which is also associated with the ocean, with water, and with destruction by water. So, but it's also associated with God's sort of full expression of mercy, as much as it can be, in the lower worlds. So, but they're still higher. So it's like a realm. Well, you know this, but it's a realm above us, and so that is often where I think like if you're going to trace it, sometimes people say Saturn, but I actually think this idea of Jupiter and what that is so fundamental, especially to Abrahamic religion, especially Judaism and Christianity, especially those two, maybe less so with Islam. But I think that this idea of that force of water, of like, you have committed sin, so we are just going to cleanse it. We're going to wash you away. There's an interesting book. I forgot who it's by, but it's called Catholicism and Freemasonry. It's from the early 1900s. I'm sure you're familiar with it.
Yeah, maybe.
He talks a lot about the Christian Kabbalah of these sort of concepts, and then he placed Azazel as analogous to Samael. I'm not saying I disagree or agree, but that's his positioning. And so he said it was Gavura or Mars. So then there's this other obviously interesting idea of the fire and the sort of outpouring of heat. And yes, that's what Mars definitely does. But there's also this idea in Kabbalah that you cannot, Chesed or the ocean always has to be in synthesis with Gavura, because you don't want the overproduction of heat or the flooding of the world. Like they have to work together in this synthesis. So I think that there's also something interesting with that in looking at what you said even earlier about how they would take human wives, because there is something of synthesis. There is and that is very the story of humanity, whether you want to take it as more of a racial story, like the theosophical way, like the 5 roots or whatever, or you can think of it as more of like we are just a shifting population, and we always have been in many ways. I'm not saying that there isn't cultural management and all of that, but I think that I think we are much more in many ways interrelated than we're not, and what divides us is a lot more ideological, so sort of the bullshit layer more than anything else.
And those derisions, if you go back into the text, they seem like they've been to a great extent, created to cause derision between. It's much like the Tower of Babel when all the tongue was divided, so that we couldn't talk to one another anymore. It's a very interesting concept. But as far as these watchers taking wives of earth women, the Bible says, they came into them, and then there was giants on the earth in those days. And if you read the book of Enoch, it talks about that the mothers became pregnant, and these giants in the belly basically were too big, so they ripped out of the side, which is where we get the idea of the cesarean section. The Caesar was born through cesarean section. There was a big at one point in Roman history, there was the idea that if you were born through cesarean section, that you were somehow more tied to the ideas of what the godheads were, or the fallen ones, in regard to the power element itself. And also we see who is it? Shiva. When she comes down, she doesn't come down, but she's born to the side as well. So, and Lucifer, or Pan, he walked to the. So there's this whole idea about moving to the side through the histories versus coming, through the central passage, which I think esoterically speaks, to many concepts on many levels.
No, you're 100% correct. I was thinking of that image of Durga. Today is the 22nd, and so it's a Dakini day, and so for any Buddhists out there, and it's also Lumchen Dechen, which is when the Buddha went up to heaven and spoke to the 33 gods in heaven, and then after 3 days he descended back down this ladder with 33 rungs on it.
Yep.
Right, and so the gods bow down to him. Those gods bound down to a man, and Buddha is a man. Like, that's the whole idea of that. And so was Zoroaster. Right. So I think, like, when you're looking at these, because Buddhism, especially early Buddhism, so this isn't my kind of Buddhism, but this is the early Buddhism, there's a deep relationship between Zoroastrianism, especially the early Zoroastrianism, like what more Zoroaster was talking about, and the early sort of shamanic forest tradition Buddhism, for sure. Right. So that's a really interesting idea, and just a sort of synchronicity, we'll say, of the day. Yeah. But I was thinking of the Durga, how she stands upon the buffalo, but the buffalo, the spear that she holds is pointed directly, like, into a certain particular place on the buffalo, but it's not its head, it's not its neck, it's sort of in this underside, like very Mithraic, like in the side. But the buffalo is really a personification of the Anasura with a name. So, and when you're doing the mantra japa for Durga, you offer one mantra, just one to the Asura, in recognition that he is serving his sort of divine or cosmic function in the whole cycle. So his life and rebirth as a demon is sort of propagated so we can worship.
Right. Yeah.
Requires a sacrifice.
Yeah. And now, interestingly, you talk about the 33 rung ladder and the 33 heavenly entities. Very much along those same lines, Enoch, with his night journey, and the night journey itself is something that we see culturally. Jacob has a night journey. We have, which results in the Jacob's ladder, very much the ladder story again there. And just over and over, we see these different individuals that are visited by higher, angelic per se forces, and they take them into the heavens and show them the workings of the manifest universe. And Enoch may be one of the earliest stories where we have one of these night journeys, and it says that these beings that came to see him were as flaming fire, and they basically took him into the heavens and showed him how the winds worked. They showed him the pillars of heavens. They show him the different gates of all the miscellaneous planetary bodies and how they work. And then they take Enoch into the great abyss, right? And they tell Enoch that basically these Grigori, or these angels that have had sex with women, that they'll be bound here in this realm for some 10,000 years for basically coming in and bastardizing reality.
No, you're 100% right, because that is what magic, and that's what all of the practices that you described are really about. It's really about changing Maya. Maya is like a natural existing force, right? It's just the light, the luminous sort of quality of the heavenly bodies, the stars and the sun and the planets, that illuminate what we could call the carnal ground, but it's also what we could call the garden. So that's just that should be normal. But then it's what the practices that you're talking about is to influence how that light is perceived and understood. So
Right.
I think that you could take this very parapolitically as well. Like, you look at what's going on right now, it's just a shit show. So
Yeah.
right, you can't, it's sort of inseparable from these sort of cosmological allegories. And so I think this is what is really interesting about your work in particular, and then sort of what I'm doing in my own way. But yeah, so I'm really glad that you said all of that.
Now, what's interesting is when Enoch is in this abyss, and we've talked about the key to the mysteries being these 7 stars, right? And relating to the Pleiades as the key to the mysteries itself. And what's interesting is within Enoch, while he is visiting the abyss, which he basically, the angel asks him, why are you, afraid? And Enoch's like, please take me out of this fearful place, because they're in, essentially the abyss, right? And the angel takes Enoch to these 7 stars, right, that are in the abyss, and basically calls it the space between, right? Or in another place they call it the hollow spaces. But the angel tells Enoch at one point that the 7 stars that are in the abyss are the end of reality, or are where our reality, our realm ends. So in the significance of the tree of life and the different spheres, is this the point at which Malkuth transits into another dimensional realm? I mean, it's just interesting philosophically, them talking about these 7 star, and there's 7 mountains made of different metals. There's all these different elements of the 7 within Enoch itself. But yeah, I was curious as to what you think about the whole 7 stars being the point of the end of this realm.
Well, I'm really glad that you asked me for my opinion, because I have, or at least I have an idea of like how similar the comparative mythology between the two.
Right.
So we'll just go through it a little. I know that I've gone over it with you, but for the people listening, I'll go through it quickly. Is there 7 star goddesses? They're called the Ashta Matrika or the Sapta Matrika. So it can be a grouping of 7, and it can also be a grouping of 8. So India prefers the 7, and Nepal/Tibet preferred the 8. However, the 8 is not an additional mother. It's actually in reference to the mind-born daughter. Okay, so I won't get into that, but that's why that there is a sort of a paradox, but it's not really a paradox when you understand. So there are 7 mothers. The primary mother is the wolf, or the bear-headed, but it can also be wolf-faced goddess, and she is the primordial consort, sort of like the Gnostic idea of the falling Sophia, and then she transforms into this ferocious figure. But in Buddhism, she transforms, but then she also serves, just like I said with the Asuras, she serves part of the cosmic function. So we don't call her evil per se. She just is who she is. And so it's sort of, each one represents, they're not all animal headed, but you can also say that they're all animal headed. It's one of those things that, yes, they can be depicted as that, or they can be depicted slightly differently, but they're all so they're all related to the Pleiades. They're all star goddesses, and they come down to the material plane in a red, sort of a crimson tide, you could say, falling down. And sometimes you see this even in astrological terms. They have the fairy lights, these red lights that sort of descend into the world. That would be exactly how the matrikas were understood. If you were to see that, you would say, okay, the seven mothers are descending, and they are seven goddesses of Mamos. So it's a Tibetan word. It means chaos, basically. So they're very chaotic. They are the rulers of the blood ocean. They are also the producers of the blood ocean, particularly the central figure, so who has the wolf's face. So it's very interesting that. And then you're also saying they can be, it's a hollow space. Well, one of the names in the chants for the matrikas are the sunken ones, or hollow ones, because the idea is that they bleed out through menstruation the world, like the creation. Right. So they're kind of dried husks. When they're here, they're kind of, that's why they're ferocious and hungry and looking for destruction. It's not because they want destruction per se, but it's because they want to destroy the world so they can liberate what they are, which is really light, right, trapped in matter. They want to liberate light from the matter that they find themselves trapped in. But then Buddhism, we'd also add the layer that it's all conceptual, like the trap is just conceptual. So once you see through the trap, the trap is to know that there's no trap. Right. So it's just conceptual. But yeah, so they exist. I think that this is very similar. I think that we see the Pleiades be very similar throughout all the cosmology, the Greek cosmology, the Egyptian, everything. And also I think that they play a really important role in the Puranas of raising the son of Shiva, who's Mara, which means the son. So it's like has a very Christ-like, he has a very Christ-like thing. And interestingly, he holds a spear, and he's associated with the number 6. So, but he's also a war. So he's also the 5, so the Gavura going into the 6, which is Tiferet. So you can say, like, he's also the 11. He's like what makes things go up and down. He's like the pole, right? So she raises him, and the idea is that she's also the wife of Shiva, but in that state of consciousness, she doesn't know it. She's mad, she's angry. So she gives him the book of tantras, or the book of spells, or the book of the unmaking names of creation, and says, you should study this like your father studies it, like I've studied it, and then give it to the people. But they can also like partake in the fruits of this sort of practices, these more theurgic or more magical mystery school traditions. And he said, basically what happens is he ends up rebelling against the father, against Shiva, and he says, like, I don't want anything to do with you. Like, he has like some daddy issues, clearly. And so he revolts in a way, and he splits the tree of knowledge into 2 distinct parts. So it's the tree, they don't call it the tree of knowledge, they call it the tree of the golden mango. But this has the sort of alchemical value of being a tree that is the tree of knowledge, but he splits it in half. And so one side falls into the ocean, and the other side is harvested by the people who live nearby, and they use it to build their civilization, or their temple, or whatever it is. So he became from the left, he was a completely left-handed deity in the earliest time, completely only transgressive practice. But in later time, he became only a right-handed deity. And I know you'll find this interesting. His mount is a peacock, or his Vahan is a peacock. So this also obviously correlates a lot to the Yazidi deity and the
Malak House.
Yes, exactly. Who could be understood to be an expression of Ahura Mazda. And I think there were people who made this connection as well.
Yeah, I've made that connection as well, for sure. And interestingly, you say about these 7, feminine deities that are bleeding out reality, and are basically dried husks. When you get into the story of the Leviathan, as far as the feminine energy, some places say preserved in brine. Some places say that she is salted. But I think what it comes down to is the fact that this divine feminine energy has basically sunken into and become and created the salt of the earth, which is matter itself. And that feminine energy is kind of stuck being reality until the end times, when at the feast, at the marriage feast at end times, that this entity will basically be eaten by the elect. So reality itself will be eaten by the ones that are able to rise above it, and nourish them in the force of moving even higher into higher ascended levels. So I think that's a very interesting comparison there.
This idea of eating reality, this sort of consumptive force. So this often gets ascribed, obviously, to the mother and in the sort of divine feminine in her most ferocious, right? Not always, but often when she is sort of starved of attention from God the Father. And so I do think it's interesting, though, because it doesn't necessarily mean blood or food. Like, you could take it more conceptual layer, which is, you could say fame is very much like the deification of celebrities, which are now not really as much as potent as they were like 10 years ago. But you could say this has a lot to do with the deification of current politicians. And sort of how that they are eating reality by what the kids call winning, quote unquote. Like when they win on social media, that's in a way consuming reality, because they're consuming both the love and the hatred from people.
Yeah. Well, and even the memes, Carlson from what's the Parents Just Don't Understand their show, Beverly, whatever it is, but he does that dance where he's all happy, and I just saw some Trump person posting how this is how happy they were in regard to Trump and it's these creation of these mind cults that basically people really become saturated with and wash themselves in and associate themselves with. And in many ways, I think it's unhealthy to tie yourself to these machinations of physical reality, but yeah, it is an interesting phenomenon for sure. Back to Enoch, right? And the seven, we were talking about the idea of these seven miscellaneous factors throughout the seven mountains, seven stars. Enoch also talks about the watchers coming down, and when he lists out the watchers, there's seven watchers in total, and the watchers are Uriel, who is over the world and turmoil and terror. And then you have Raphael, who is a holy angel over the spirits of men. And then you have Raguel, who is the holy angel that takes vengeance on the luminaries. And then you have Michael, who is the holy angel over the virtues of mankind and over chaos. And then you have Sir Achael, who is the holy angel over the spirit of who is the sin in the spirit, which I find interesting. And then you have Gabriel, who is the holy angel over paradise, the serpents, and the cherubim. And then you have Remael, who is the holy angel who God set over those who rise. So we have seven of the watchers that are essentially, and they basically come down and watch reality and watch these miscellaneous aspects of reality that they are overseers of through the course of the machination and turning of the progression of reality itself.
So, I mean, everything angelology has become a particular fascination of mine, but I just want to say one angel. I mean, all the angels are worth discussing, honestly, individually.
Oh, yeah.
But I think that the idea of Gabriel being the angel over paradise, in particular relation to the Sefer Yetzirah, is really interesting because that book posits that we live on the moon, like where our reality at least happens, whether that's conceptual or astrological, right? We're not saying either
as
one.
a reflection or a
Exactly.
projection, one of the two.
Yes, exactly what you're saying, Robbie. It can be either or and all of the above. So that's really interesting because then it would imply that maybe we'd also live on paradise if we think of it that way. Like
if we can open our eyes to see it.
Yes, exactly. But I also think it's interesting, Michael, or Miguel, as you said. So because he is the prince, right? He is the prince that can move from Mercury up into Tiferet, or from Odin to Tiferet. So he moves from the prince into like he's not the king, quite the king, but there is something. He's the lord of the abyss, kind of.
He's over chaos.
Right. He's standing over chaos, which is exactly what the sun in that position would be. Right. And also in the Afro-syncretic traditions in Kimbanda, he is considered to be the king of the abyss. Like they would say that he is the first spirit that you sort of contact in Kimbanda, so you can work with the lower spirits in that system, but he's the king of all of them. Now, that doesn't make him good or bad. It just, he is more ferocious in their conception of it. But I think it fits. I think he has this dualistic nature, exactly like how you described it. Like there's a part of him that, yes, he is just like the sun is a minor malefic. Like the sun gives us all those civilizational wonders and institutional science and all these things that can be, it could be great, but and the state and all that, but it often, there's a seamy underbelly. So, and that's very like how Michael is, I would say, too, in just some more in the true angelology, where you're not looking at it as just like, oh, the cherubim are flying around me, protecting me. I mean, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Right. Oh, yeah. Well, and the other thing I find interesting is when you look at these messianic cycles through time, we have essentially, it's Gabriel that comes down and is the messenger for Enoch. And then by the time you get up to, and Gabriel as well comes to Abraham. But by the time you get to Mary and Jesus and the Catholicism, you see the messenger changed to Michael or Michael. And then by the time you get to Islam, again, we see that Muhammad was visited and taken on his night journey by Gabriel as well. So we see the shifting range from Gabriel to Michael to Gabriel. And I think it has something to do with masculine versus feminine powers ruling over the planetary element itself.
I agree with you 100%. And I think it also has a lot to do with solar versus lunar calendrical systems, right? Because we know in Judaism, like the preference is like God is, or time is contained in nine is Yesod, which is the lunar sphere. So you can see right away that like in Judaic esotericism, they preference like the lunar schedule, but the Christian and especially the Roman Catholic will say that's the most magical per se, and probably it is, maybe Orthodoxy as well, but we'll say Christianity or Catholicism in particular is the mystical tradition, sort of. And so to posit it against that, they prefer a solar schedule,
right,
at almost to the exclusion of the lunar, exclusion of the feminine. But the feminine's also contained in Mary. Right. So she's a really obviously interesting figure. She's lunar. She's always described as standing on the crescent moon. She stands on the dragon or on the serpent or on the hill of roses. So she can take different positions in the tree, certainly, depending on her form. But she also always has this inherent relationship with the moon, with this maternity, with the matrilineal lineage, with the water.
Right. Definitely. Another factor that I found interesting in Enoch was after the abyss, Enoch is taken into the heavens and he sees a fire in the west. That they say that this fire in the west is the power of all the stars in the heaven. All the luminary bodies come from the singular source of power in the West.
Well, in Tantra, the Buddha of the West is Amitabha, who is red. So he's the red Buddha, and his name can be translated as infinite light. But and his family, which is the Lotus family, they are in charge of power. That's sort of their metaphysical function. So if you see like a red dakini, not all dakinis are in his family, but certain ones that are red, or certain male deities that are red, their function, their magical function is magnetization, subjugation, but not subjugation through force. It's subjugation through more of a, it's like an overwhelming power. And so things naturally sort of recognize that it's too powerful for them to confront, so they subjugate themselves. That's more the idea. So yeah, and so I definitely think that this is really important, because he is the Buddha of the Western carnal ground, of the Western Pure Land as well. So it's very much like Gavura, and how Gavura functions as like a hammer that kind of pulls away like a flintlock on a musket. It's the potential is really the gunpowder. So Mars doesn't really have the gunpowder, but it's in what we do as people, like it's in the realm of men and dragons, you could say.
Right.
And so we make this thing, and then Mars has the fire, the potential to activate it with its like through force. So the movement of the mechanism, and then also the pressure.
Right. Sort of a cosmic trigger.
Yes, exactly. You understood. Okay.
Yeah, for sure. And then the angels take Enoch to visit the tree of life itself. And there's a beautiful description of the tree of life in regard to it being scarlet and gold, and the entire tree essentially being translucent flames. And it says that the fruit of the tree is for the elect. Again, this idea of the elect at the end of time, getting to devour these elements to raise them into higher realms, you know?
So do you come down on pomegranate as the tree of life? This is kind of a side note, but it's just something I often think about. Like what different.
When you get into the mysteries, the pomegranate was regarded as the ark. It held all of the gestating kernels of life that would revivify the earth. So symbolically, it's a very, great symbol, for the fruit from the tree of life. I've also heard of Ramon, which that's the name of the pomegranate. But I've also heard of citrine being a sort of like a elongated lemon. I've also heard, and I think really when you get into the apple, the idea of the apple, that's very Apollyon, or dealing with Apollo, because when he came as a Hyperborean, when he came down, he brought his medicinal gardens, and he brought the apple tree. And so, the apple to the Druids was seen as, just like the oak, was seen as the head. It was analogous to the head of the individual, and that the all heal, or the mistletoe, during the winter solstice would essentially sprout where the third eye is within the mind. And so the apple tree itself was considered the head, whereas the all heal mistletoe was considered as the sprouting and growing of the third eye itself into seeing entire realms. So I think there's this displace. Again, this comes down to cultural elements that take what they have at hand and see them as cosmic symbols within the whole. And basically, you have these different machinations evolving based on the cultural aspect of where they are and the things available to them.
I completely agree. I think, just to respond to the point that I cheekily asked you about pomegranates, but I also think There is an interesting Gnostic text. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's called the Epinoia of Nuria. I've been doing what will now be a 6-part series on this subject on spaces. And so one of the ideas I can't remember if it's in Hypothesis, specifically when the daughter is mentioned. So this is the daughter of Eve. It has deep Kabbalistic connections to the 22nd path, which is the path of Lamed. So Lamed Mem dot, love is the cause of knowledge, but it also refers to Eve and her heart. So the daughter is the heart of Eve. And so in the Hypothesis, there's an idea that the Sophia was sexually assaulted, we'll call it, by the archons. But then when Nuria goes to confront the angel Eleleth, which is the angel that appears to the daughter specifically, she says to him, "Oh, the archons threatened to assault me in the same way that they did my mother and make her the whore of Babylon," or whatever. And so then the angel Eleleth says to her, the archons actually can't do that. The archons can't even assault you. They didn't even assault your mother, because everything that they say is a lie. And so what is it's obviously a more Christian Gnostic text, but so they say, like, what is the truth but the light of, like, what is the truth but like the mind of God and the wisdom of the mother.
Right.
And that is embodied in the daughter, which is you. And so there's this other idea that she burned down the ark 2 times because she found it imperfect, and then on the 3rd time she allowed Noah to carry off, but he did not actually allow her entrance because it was said that she was sexually assaulted by the archons.
Right.
So.
Well, and that gets in, when you look at the serpent in the garden, basically misconstruing the story, and this is the idea of dialectics, and playing with our minds through playing one side against the other. That's essentially, I think, more than anything, what the story in the garden is about. And the fact that Adam and Eve, or Eve first, then feeding the fruit to Adam, corrupted, the divine couple, that once and it's much like the story of the fall of Lucifer, essentially, where once you are no longer vibrating in that pure essence of what divine paradise is, and you see the 1 to the 0, the flipping and the flopping back and forth, that essentially, because you're no longer resonating in that state, and you see the good and you see the evil, that there's that diametric idea of the fall in the create, and it's why within the Jewish texts, they talk about, the Elohim had to make a garment for the divine couple to enter into matter, because they were moving from an etheric light form and sinking into a crystallized form, going from the monad and moving into duality.
This is really an interesting idea, which goes a little bit beyond the Book of Enoch, but I think it also ties into the series, because the idea of the names of God and how many names there are, is it a monad? Is it a dyad? And so this seems to be very reoccurrent as well, and as well as the little intricacies of disagreement, even within sometimes the same tradition. So we would say in Tantra that yes, there's a monad, but that's unimportant. But then there's also a dyad, which is a little more important, because that is sort of the reflection of the ultimate primordial natures, which is emptiness and compassion. So both of those things in union. So it is technically a monad, but they're still distinct, but they're also empty. So they don't really have a contour of a nature. They are luminous. It's completely like, it's ineffable and beyond our sort of comprehension of what that means. So yeah, I think that there's something really interesting with that. And then how the more defined you give names to God, or the more specific the name, the lower the sort of expression it is in the world, the lower quality, you could even say.
Right. Well, and that's why within the Hebrew philosophy, you were not even necessarily allowed to say the name of the Godhead, because it lowered it in essence into a lower form. Yeah, very much so, very much so. Now then, Enoch, he goes on to go into the middle of the earth, which is where these Grigori, or these Gigantos, are trapped. And basically, this is the same place that when Jesus is crucified, that he essentially goes into the middle of the earth to profess the good news to these trapped souls. Initially Enoch talks about, that these entities are going to be locked away for 10,000 years. The Bible itself talks about Tataria, where essentially these entities will be deposited in this sunken or hidden space, and they'll be like zipped up, and at the end of time it will be as though they never existed, to bastardize the system. So I just find it interesting. And again, back to the book of Enoch, inflecting and really leading and giving a lot to the stories in the New Testament. I think it's one of the bigger stories that kind of contributes as a force multiplier to make the story move, that has been occulted.
You're so right on this, and this even really intersects with something that I'm thinking about lately, is that there is something really deeply Rosicrucian or even just esoteric about certain kinds of Christianity. And I think that what would serve it really well is to actually emphasize those elements rather than occult them, because then actually I think people could have like a better grasp of the way the world is, as well as sort of tools to deal with what we could call supernatural, but not necessarily supernatural. But they would have like more of a skill set in which to engage these things, even just the ways of thinking about these things. Right. Because knowledge is not always something you do, it's just something that you hold on to for a little while. So I think that would really be the way. I'm not saying that you want to, or even I want to resuscitate Catholicism or anything, but I'm just saying that would be probably useful for a lot of people, I think, because I see a lot of people sort of flailing, not of totally their own fault, but of flailing to sort of grasp all the sort of astrological, cosmological, and mythological movements of the last like 10 years, we'll say. And in the sort of Protestant version, so he even has less books than the King James version. I just feel like without Enoch, I agree with you that it doesn't fully make sense. There's like elements like Book of Jubilees. Now, do you have to believe everything that is in Book of Jubilees? No, but it lays a lot of the groundwork for why Genesis is the way it is written. So I think it's just useful to understand these things instead of label them good or evil, or even say that you believe them. You don't have to believe them.
And the Book of Jubilees, again, is focused around the number 7, and the 7-year cycle that leads the 7 times 7, giving you the 49, which is the cycle where essentially the financial system is reset and all the slaves are freed and everyone's books go to zero, because they understood that when you take a financial system and through the course of time, the inflation and all the miscellaneous debt and everything that's created basically enslaves a society, which is why the Book of Jubilees, and it's interesting that they would take something like that out of the Bible and insert, give unto Caesar what is his in regard to taxes.
Well, as you know, Robby, I am much more libertarian leaning, as I know you are. And so I agree with you. I think that there is a very good, even from Kabbalah, like I know a lot from reading about Lurius. Lurius was a scathing critic of the bureaucracy. He said that to give any, place any power in the hands of the bureaucracy was to immediately cause the fall of the paths of the tree.
Yeah.
So that's very, like, for Kabbalists, that's a very extreme language. It's basically saying it's satanic.
Yeah. So I'm reading about John Hammond Hill, who has a castle down here in Gloucester. But he was friends with Cecil Rhodes, and he was also hanging out with Colonel House, Mendel House, who was basically Mendel House, was the guy behind propagating the idea of using the bureaucracy to supersede the federal government. So yeah, these terms are very, very and that's, I think, what people really don't understand is that through the course of understanding these ancient philosophies, it leads to being able to have a deeper understanding of modern turnings. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you. I think that there needs to be a reappraisal. I think that's sort of where we are. That's sort of my thesis.
Yeah.
Like Aeon of the Daughter. We're sort of like in this place where everything is like historical, but also brand new.
Future
Because our
primitive.
cultural memory is brand new in
Yeah.
many ways, right?
So now get this, going through all the miscellaneous angel names in the book of Enoch, right? One of the ones that I found very interesting was they mentioned the angel Tyrell, right? Who is one of the angels who showed the terror on the earth, right? And if you take that Tyrell and come into the modern vernacular, that is the corporation that basically rules over and makes all the genetic simulacra humans in the series Blade Runner by Philip K. Dick. So we can see these thing, and if we understand that Tyrell is the angel who showed terror on earth, and then how Philip K. Dick turned that angel into the corporation that rules over like the GMO humans, and what is it in the Bible? It says, the flesh shall cry out for death, but none shall be found. You got to wonder about what's going to happen with all these genetic turnings within the modern idea of science. It's just interesting stuff.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's no way that you cannot look at the Book of Enoch and say that it does not have a contemporary scientific expression. I think that a lot of people have made that case, but I think that you don't have to take it. It doesn't have to be so okay. Like there's like an angel somewhere, mixing up human genetics, but it can be ideas that people carry forward into history, and they say, "Oh, I'm doing the job of this," or "This is my sort of like cosmology. This is my, abyssal star god."
Yeah, they become sort of Gregories, or these haunted entities that we kind of create within the minds of humans that facilitate certain turnings,
Absolutely. And I know, no, you're really, so this is something that I often think about is like transgression. And so when you put transgression as the popular culture, it loses a lot of its value.
Oh yeah.
Because then it's no longer really transgressive. So that's sort of what I'm thinking about is like, well, we've seen most things in the last 10 years. We've seen most things become that were almost unfathomable maybe 25 years ago. We've seen them become very mainstream. So what is this? What do we make of what transgression is now? And I would say that transgression is actually very unpowerful right at the moment, simply because of its saturation in the popular culture. And so, this has a lot to do with wheel turning, because the rights we have are left and right-handed. They're not, we do have non-dual systems, but it's difficult. It's hard to access. It's a hard state of mind to live in. Right. So, but that's kind of the key. That's kind of the true key, is the non-dual, non-right, non-left. It's kind of like somewhere in the middle, not a middle pillar. And so, that's what I think will be a trick, or it'll be difficult for some people to sort of cross that barrier, or that threshold of being like, okay, it's not about these wild extremes. It really isn't, because we've all been sort of acculturated to swing one way or swing the other way, like with rapid extremism, right?
Yeah, engineered for sure, for sure.
Engineered for sure. Well, dialectics is engineering.
One of the things that I did want to bring up was Methuselah had a dream after talking to Enoch, and in Methuselah's dream, heaven is falling to earth, and earth is swallowed into an abyss. So when you talk about regressive practices and putting the whole population into this state of debasement, you know, it does that encourage heaven to fall from earth? It very much like the Masons talk about the squaring of the circle. So you take the circle, which is the heavens, and you turn it into the square, which is the earth. It gets into, like Tracy Twyman was talking about, meat, basically with chains on the sun and the moon and pulling heavens down to earth. It gets into the Christian, Our Father, where they say on earth as it is in heaven. You see this symbolically carried over time and time again. But is there, again, back to the Lurian Kabbalah and the idea of setting the disposition for the Messiah to return by debasing society, by plunging earth into the abyss through debasement? Are they drawing or pulling the heavens down in essence? You know what I mean?
I would say they believe it does. Now, does it?
Right.
That's the question. Let me also shout out my co-host for the Twyman series, Zach Shumar. Without him, it would never have happened. So I have to always, give him credit for that. And we are friends. And so, so I think, and I said this in our Twyman episode, is that I said, the devil card is showing a lot of what you're describing with me, what Tracy was describing. But the chains are not around your hands. They're around your neck. So the chains can be lifted off if you so choose. If you know your will, they can be lifted off. But if you believe that they are there, if you believe your hands are chained, then they are.
Right. Yeah, we are shackling ourselves with our own mind-born, inflections.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I think that that's a lot to do with like the oaths of these like peculiar brethren, as we'll call them, to borrow the language. There are people who really, their whole thing is like the domination control. And then there's clearly some other people who are more renegade, maybe, or more like freedom oriented. I know JJ Vance, who will be a guest on this show very soon, and he talks a lot about like how there are elements of what he studies, which is Society of Cincinnatus, which I know you know something about as well.
I've been digging into that,
yeah. There's like a liberty element, or at least a Luciferian element, at least enough to where they're like, maybe mass enslavement is a bad idea.
Right. Well, but Cincinnatus goes all the way back to the golden age of Saturn, and what is it, Sylvania and Cincinnatus, and it's a very, very ancient story, and it's kind of hard to find a lot of information about since the original origin of Cincinnatus, but now there's one more idea here that I want to talk about in regard to the Book of Enoch, and then I think we can kind of tie it up. So now there's this Enoch has a dream that he tells to Methuselah, right? And it gets into, and we've had discussions about bulls and cows and different types of sacrifice and what these symbolic elements of color mean. But there's a whole dream where basically a white bull comes out of the earth and and has offspring, and these offspring are, you have the white bull, you have the red bull, and you have the black bull. And there's essentially this interfighting and kind of interplay between these colors, which again here ties us back to the discussion we just had with Nick in regard to alchemy, these colors.
So why don't we just revisit that for a few minutes? So there's just a little bit about the colors, and since you are an artist, it's interesting to hear what particularly stands out to you in that discussion, and then also if you have any agreements or disagreements with the way it is articulated.
Yeah, I mean, it's in regard to alchemy. You have the negrito, which is the prima materia, which is basically what you create all of everything out of. But interestingly, this first bull that comes out of the earth is a white bull, and then its offspring are these three colors. But through alchemy, you basically burn off the impurities, and that's when you get to the white stone, which is essentially where you're separating out the oils from the salt, and the salt is the white ash that's left over, and then you have this fine distilled oil that you've essentially brought out of the blackness, and then you take that oil and you refine that oil into a crystalline state, which becomes red. So I think there is some interplay here with the ideas of alchemy and the creation of life on earth.
There is absolutely, alchemy is at the heart of all esotericism. It's deeply embedded in Tantra. It's very understudied, even for Western scholars on Tantric Buddhism. But there are some that have written a lot on it. The Enochian intake cycle is a very famous medical cycle that talks about the transmutation of mercury from nature, from an alchemical sort of methodology using different burners and distilling it down. And then there's also a magical purification method. So there's a natural,
right.
And a magical, but they all can also work together. Like you can do all of those three processes, which are 7 stages each, interestingly enough.
Exactly. Well, and so now these bulls, as they become manifest on earth, Enoch details that the fallen ones come down and mate with these bulls, and the offspring are asses, elephants, and camels. And the asses and the elephants and the camels take up swords and begin to fight with the bulls. And one of the bulls actually turns into and becomes a man. Right. And if you get into the early stories within the Bhagavad Gita of the fallen ones coming down, they essentially hid out in caves. And some of the first forms that they took were elephants, asses, and camels. So, I find that interesting. But that's when essentially Enoch talks about there's a flood in this dream that basically is to cleanse the earth, and the black and the white and the red offspring, are essentially saved. And then that gives birth to the sheep and the wolves, and the wolves they begin to devour the sheep, and the sheep refuse to cry out. That's another kind of common thing we see in the text is, these animals that become so afraid that they are silenced, and shaking and trembling. And I think it kind of leads to the idea of these generations and kind of what they represent within the movement of the timescapes of the aeons as things precipitate, right? And then a ram becomes the leader of the sheep. But then it says that the eagles come and begin to eat the eyes and the flesh and leave only the bones of the sheep, which, and this is 200 to 2000 BC potentially that this was written. And a lot of people think that this is a prophecy of the Romans basically coming in, and the conflict between the Hebrews and the Romans and the Tau and the temple itself, right? And then it talks about the ravens and the eagles are both eating the lambs. And then the ram, he basically hits his staff upon the earth, and the ground opens up and swallows all the bad animals. So this is the dream that Enoch conveys to Methuselah. basically prophesying, very much like the Jacob's Ladder story, kind of how he sees all of time, laid out before him, and he sees the generations and the wars and all the things that will happen on the terrible hill, which is where, Solomon's temple is built. Jesus was crucified. Abraham was sacrificed. But yeah, I just find it interesting in regard to prophecy.
Prophecies are such an interesting thing because they can be taken locally. Like, you can understand like the Book of Enoch, you can understand to have a geographic specific region, but maybe other people who live in like Iraq, like I know some of the Mandians, they think it's about Babylon from the 2nd century AD. So they, everybody interprets it in their own sort of way. And so
Right.
who's the star of the story, I think, is very dependent on who's reading the text.
Yeah, for sure. Again, yeah. But yeah, it's just the whole Enoch's vision, the idea that man shall ascend, that and they detail the idea that the root shall be scattered, kind of like you have the rise of the Israelites and the origin of the Hebrews themselves, but then it says that the root once this, because within eschatology, there have been some people that have detailed this the Enochian calendar, basically to be Enoch to Noah to Abraham to Moses to Solomon to Jesus, and then there'll be an apostate time where evil will rise upon the earth. And it kind of has to do with this idea that the root of the Hebrews being scattered and an apostate group rising, which I see analogous to Zion, basically Zionism. Yeah.
I mean, this is the thing, Robby, is that I don't disagree with you in its foundations of
Right.
what that idea is. It's just where I'm like, that phrase is so used, and it sometimes I think it's fair, and sometimes I think it's not fair. I don't think you say it unfairly. I know what you're referring to. I just think that in the general parlance, it gets, and I think that's intentional. Gets sort of obfuscated of what that even really means. But I don't disagree with you that there are just clearly these people, like there are clearly people in the world, regardless of religion or ethnicity, that do believe that they are fulfilling ancient ideas or embodying ancient ideas and ancient prophecies. Now, is it all a LARP? Is it all real? I don't know, but I definitely think they believe it. So it's useful for us to look at the things that they believe in, or at least discuss what we can access of what they believe in.
And I'm definitely saying these are things that people have worked out of the Enochian calendar, not necessarily things that I believe.
100%.
So, but just, within the Book of Enoch, it's very vast. It details a lot of information that in no way could we even begin to fully justify the extent that is within the book. And then you get into the calendar and how he lays out all the days and the seasons and the houses and the movements and the astral bodies. But there's so many precursors, like when the Noahide laws, as far as a precursor to the Noahide laws, Enoch, he sees them eating blood when they have good things to eat, but they prefer to eat the flesh and drink the blood, going back to cannibalism. There's fragments of the book of Noah, which basically details Noah's birth, his red hair and glowing eyes. His father, Lamech, was afraid because he saw him as more like a god man than a human, so he calls up Enoch, and Enoch explains everything to him. But yeah, now the other thing with the Enochian calendar, when we look at Ezra to Jesus, it's 490 years. And there's this prophetic cycle that you see in various places, that I think its root origin comes out of Enoch, where it's essentially this, in Rastafarian music, there's a band called Culture, and they have this record called Two Sevens Clash, and it's about the beginning of time to Zion, to the end of time. And basically, that prophet cycle, that 7 times 7 giving you 49, basically related to the 490-year cycle, which we had between Ezra and Jesus. Like, people that are into eschatology, they've basically said that the Enochian calendar is the only calendar that fits the 70-week prophecy of Daniel, which is talking about the arrival of the Messiah, being the prophecy of Jesus, essentially. So it's just interesting how people have taken all this information and kind of, and if we are to believe some, apocalypse has already happened at Megiddo, and that fight is already done, and we're long past that. Whereas the eschatologists, the Lurians, they believe that, even within Judaism and Christianity, they believe there's this returning Messiah that's going to somehow save us and take us all to a higher realm, and whether you want to see that as a physical machination that's outside the body, or whether you want to take that as a internal machination that is a story that tells us within ourselves how to, bring ourselves to higher planes of being, can be debated. But it's just interesting, again, back to prophecy and prophetic action, and how much that has inflected on the modern world itself.
That was a great place to sort of close out, but I want to say two short things, Robby, is that I'll start with this, is the 49, or this idea that you said 490, and then also a 49-day cycle, or 49-year cycle, excuse me. The 49 is an extremely important number in Kabbalah because it is 4, which is Chesed, and 9, which is Yesod. So it is the rectification of the world through mercy. Again, the idea of water, but again, doesn't necessarily mean a flood. A flood can also mean through this idea of mercy, pure mercy, 100% mercy, no negative quality at all. Just
baptism by water.
Yes, exactly. A baptism by water. So that is really important. And Christ is also associated with the number 13. And so you can also break down and say 1 plus 3. So what are the 3? The 3 are the 3 elements. So it's fire, earth, and water. Those are mixed together, and then then you produce air. So exactly. So this is a very important concept. And then also the Yesod, the moon, well, we said it has a lunar element, so obviously this goes along to my other series, the Aeon of the Daughter, but I do think that there is it's a kind of a twin, is what I've posited. It's like a syzygy, or sort of like a complementary, not an antithetical, but a complementary force to the sun. And so what does that mean? And so I think that you're totally right, is that we have to balance out what the meanings are and not take them to either be super gross or to be super subtle. It's sort of neither nor. You're middle path again, and
very much
and you're balancing it out. So I think that that's probably the healthiest and best place sort of to be. But then also the Maitreya, I just wanted to touch on this because obviously you study theosophy, you study all these ancient cosmologies. So the Maitreya often comes up among researchers because obviously the theosophists were very obsessed with this idea. In Tantra, the Maitreya is really only the worldly body of the cosmic Buddha. He may not even know he is the Maitreya. It's that subtle. It's not someone, it's not a messianic figure. It's more it's just the idea of the messianic figure, which you're to be sort of working yourself towards by doing practices. It's not waiting for someone to save you. It's saying, yeah, there might be these interplays of the cosmos, and people are being reborn and dying and reborn, but you have to keep going and keep moving forward, rather than stay stuck on the cosmic cycle or stay stuck on eschatology. Like you just keep going because we live in a cycle. So, right. So that's what the Maitreya. I just wanted to, for the record, say that is what the Maitreya is, rather than this messianic figure.
Right. And I think that the Theosophists Blavatsky were basically playing on this 490-year cycle to try to bring forth a sort of a Messiah figure to be worshipped. It's I mean, but again, over and over we see within Judaism, they have these rising messiahs that they later deny. It's always, the idea of the false Messiah. No man shall know the time when he shall come. It's the whole messianic or Masonic concept that interplay within all these ideas it's very intriguing.
Yes, I 100% agree, and we will leave it at that for part 1, Book of Enoch, 1 Enoch. I'll probably call it something clever. I might just call it 1 Enoch too. So thank you so much, Robby, for your time and for coming on and just being awesome. And so you leave by just giving your Linktree socials, whatever you want to plug, and I'll make sure to include it in the show notes, and as well send you audio copy when we're done.
Yeah, if anybody is interested to see all the miscellaneous things I like to dip my toes in, I have my art, I have social media, Twitter. I do a lot of political commentary and posting my notes as I'm doing research. But you can check all of that stuff out on my Linktree, which is Linktree RMARX Marx at Linktree, and that'll pull up everything for you.
Awesome. And that will, of course, be included in the show notes so everybody can go check Robby out. And then, so this will be part 1. And next time, Robby will do part 2. And so, and thank you so much and have a great day. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. It's a great talk.